Nice. Good. Anyway, welcome everyone. Welcome to this webinar on the World Toilet Day that SuSanA has put together. Before we begin with the content, just some initial housekeeping rules. Please keep your microphones switched off so that only the speaker's voice is heard. And when you're speaking, don't forget to switch your microphone on. The session will be recorded, as you can see the red dot somewhere in Canada on Arne's screen. So please keep in mind, if somebody has an issue with it, please write to us on the chat. Use the chat also for any immediate questions that you might have as the speakers talk, and we will try to pick this up as we go. Otherwise, there's also a separate round of audience questions in the very end. So keep that in mind. Excellent. So welcome once again, and today is World Toilet Day. To give you a bit of a history on why this day came about is back in 2001, I think the World Toilet Organization started this as an advocacy campaign. But by 2013, there was a UN resolution that was passed, which made this an official World Toilet Day event that is being celebrated all across the world with the UN flag. But today is also a day for us to reflect on why toilets are important, especially in 2021, the theme is value toilets. According to JMP's latest statistics that came out earlier this year, 3.6 billion people lack access to safely managed sanitation, of which 580 million people have limited access to sanitation, which means they have shared facilities. 616 million people have unimproved sanitation facilities, and 494 million people still defecate in the open. Fortunately, the numbers have reduced from billions to millions as I was speaking, because in the last 5 years, especially between 2015 to 2020, we have had some really important improvements that happen. Every year, just in this period, about 1/3 of all openly defecating populations have we've made progress there. But still, the progress in safely managed improved only by 7%. And at this rate, but in 2030, we would reach only 67% safely managed sanitation. That is why today is important for us to also take a moment to reflect on the journey that we have ahead, but also reflect on the journey that we have come until now. That is exactly the theme of today's webinar. We need to know what has happened in the past, what worked, what didn't, and what are some of the tools and approaches that could help us get to this universal access to safely managed sanitation by 2030. And to talk a bit more about how this journey of urban sanitation took place and how we documented some of the important milestones in it. First, I'd like to invite Arne Panesar to give us some context. Arne is the head of sector program on sustainable sanitation at GIZ, and he's going to give us a bit of context on what the Sanitation Journey publication is all about, how it started, and so on. Arne, over to you.
Thanks, Abishek. And I think you're a young, enthusiastic researcher at Eawag. I don't know if I've mentioned that. But good that we're here. And how did we come to this publication? Actually, in GIZ, we were asked again that, can you describe urban sanitation in a modular way so that water programs or other programs have an easy entry point and know how to maybe go into the field of sanitation? And why don't you describe a few cities in a modular way? So that was the task we took up. And we were thinking before doing so, we should actually have an overview on what has been done so that we don't reinvent the wheel. And we looked for some iconography. What were urban approaches? How did they try to visualize what they're doing? What are the tools, and where can we sort of step in? And in that exercise, we did a workshop and invited as well colleagues from Eawag to come to Freiburg. where we're discussing pictures, tools, iconography, and we're thinking, okay, how can that happen? How can that be brought together and be a background for the different city descriptions in different parts of the world that we were then doing? And then I was talking to Roland and said that yeah, actually it would be good to have a short description of the history of the sector in one or the other way, but it's so difficult to do. And Roland answered, well, it's actually very easy and clear. So what followed was a few interviews with Roland, with colleagues here from, I think, Mintje and Arne from the team. And we tried to write down actually what's the journey and what's the sort of the related iconography and ways to describe urban sanitation. And then it became clearer and clearer that we felt that this is not just the background for what we were trying to do in the last years in GIZ to describe a few cities and their sort of journey, but as well that it as such might be a good thing to have that as a publication. And then we had discussions as well in Zurich to go for that, and more we got something together. And personally, I'm very happy with the result, because I think many of today's problems, you can only understand a problem if you know the history of what happened before. And I'm very happy that we brought together a narrative that how did it all happen in the last 50 years. But there's a special thank you that has to go to our reviewers, because we were so driven by our iconography and tools, and we got the feedback, how can you do this without taking a South perspective and without talking of utilities and what's happening in the South? And so that led to additional texts and chapters, and I think it was absolutely useful that we could as well have that. So thanks to all the reviewers, especially two of them, which are here and as well will give their perspective. And with that, I think that's how it all came together, and I'm curious what we'll hear about it now in the coming hour in a little bit more detail. Back to you, Abishek. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arne. So what we have for you today is a panel discussion, not just about the journey publication, but also giving the context of the real journey that actually happened in producing the publication, that is Arne said, but also about what urban sanitation was like in 1960s when it started, all the way to 2021 with the latest developments. And today we have a bunch of really interesting people who contributed to the publication in significant ways. Some of them were authors, contributors, and reviewers. So first we have Roland Schertenleib, who is the first author of the publication and has given such important context to what happened in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, all from a first-hand perspective. And so Roland was the founder and former head of Sandec at Eawag, and he will talk to us a bit about some of the chapters that he contributed to significantly. Next, we have Depinder Kapur, who is the senior fellow at Nadar University and was previously heading the sanitation capacity building program at NIUA, India. We also have Elisabeth Kvarnstrom with us, who works on urban water management issues at RISE, which is research institutes in Sweden. And she's also an adjunct professor at Luleå University. We also have Jennifer McConville from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, who has over 15 years of experience in integrating resource recovery, participation, sustainability on sanitation planning. And I must have a plug in here saying, Jennifer, I really enjoyed reading your pieces. As I'm writing mine, yours is a really cool one to take some cues on. Then we have Mintje Büürma from GIZ, who works at the SuSanA Secretariat. So you must have had a lot of emails with her, exchanges on SFDs and general SuSanA stuff. We also have Prit Salian, who is an urban sanitation expert, who worked on sanitation planning across several cities and countries in Africa. And finally, we have Dorothee Spuhler, who is also a postdoc at Eawag Sandec, who is working on developing decision support tools for sanitation planning. So we're very happy to have such a very diverse set of people in today's panels who are a significant part of developing this publication. But I must also confess that although we are gender balanced today, we are not necessarily diverse enough that we don't have someone from Africa who's actually giving that perspective from a first-hand point of view. But I would like to say that Prit has worked significantly in Africa, and who was the person who wrote the Africa chapter for us, and is also currently dialing in from Nairobi, if I'm not wrong. So I hope we will be more diverse next time, but this is the truth of, this is a reflection of the truth that went into the publication itself. Good. Without any further words, let me first ask Roland. The graph that you see here kind of gives you the context of the development of urban sanitation since the 90s, and maybe you can give us even further details about what happened earlier. Could you give us a broad overview of what urban sanitation was in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and what the context was for the evolution to take place? Over to you, Roland.
Yes, thank you very much, Abishek. Well, first I start talking about chapter 2, because in chapter 2 we are giving first a general overview of how the situation in urban sanitation in the global south developed over the last decades. And the number of urban dwellers with access to improved sanitation increased significantly over the last 40 years. However, progress has been outpaced by the rapid urban growth, as we see on the picture quite clearly. In fact, the absolute number of people in urban areas lacking improved sanitation has steadily increased over the years, and today over 500 million urban dwellers still do not have access to an improved latrine or toilet. Well, progress has not only been slow, but also uneven between different regions and between different segments of the population. Main reasons for that being that for many years, the general focus was on water supply, and when attention was given to sanitation, ministries, urban authorities, utilities, and financing agencies stayed mostly within the sewer paradigm. And then in chapter 3, we are describing quite extensively how the discourse on urban sanitation evolved from the 1960s till today in the context of international development cooperation. And some of the most important approaches and tools developed over this time are also presented in this chapter. The description of the journey starts in the 1960s and 70s, when conventional sewerage was not only the technology of choice for the disposal of human excreta for cities in industrialized countries, but was also seen as a panacea for improving urban sanitation coverage in low and middle-income countries. It then describes how several projects and programs were initiated in the late 70s and 80s by some early pioneers who realized that with a conventional approach, it was impossible to reach most of the population in the developing countries, and that lower cost technologies had to be considered. They also argued that sanitation challenges should be addressed not only through a multi-technology, but also a multidisciplinary approach. An early plea was also to move away from a top-down, technology-centered approach and engage with the community in an interactive process when selecting appropriate technologies. The journey then goes on, describing some important milestones in the 90s, such as the formulation of the first approaches for strategic sanitation planning and the development of the ecological sanitation approach, considering waste as a resource. Many of these ideas of the early pioneers were reflected in the Bellaccio principles for sustainable sanitation, which were formulated in the year 2000. But initially, these ideas reached only a few interested experts, as it was very difficult to convince conventional engineers of non-conventional technologies and approaches. And it was actually not until 2007 when the Sustainable Sanitation Alliance, SuSanA, was founded in light of the UN International Year of Sanitation, that the Bellagio principles were taken seriously by a wider and since ever increasing audience. I think the most remarkable and hopefully also influential milestone in recent years was certainly in 2015, when all UN member states adopted the ambitious SDG sanitation targets. The description of the journey ends with a short description of the recently conceived citywide inclusive sanitation concept and its Manila principles formulated in 2019. And this back to you, Abishek.
Thank you so much for giving us a very quick overview of what happened in the last 40, 50 years, in fact. So much appreciated. And as you speak about Bellagio principles, I'm particularly astonished because right now I'm sitting in Bellagio and right next to where you guys wrote the principles. So it's really fascinating to understand the history. I'm going to ask you more about this as I come back in the second round. But in the first round, I'm going to get inputs from each of the authors and reviewers about one specific and kind of receive an opening statement. So I'll save the questions for later. Next, we have Depinder. Depinder, I would like to ask you something more specific about South Asia. You wrote a very important contribution from the South Asia perspective on how, when all these international development discourse was happening, there was also a significant amount of discourse that was happening within South Asia. So I would like to ask you more about what do you think is your perspective from the experiences that you've had in India and also South Asia at large? Could you give us a bit more on that?
Okay, thanks for inviting me for this kind of a learning event. And I just wanted to begin by first thanking some of the people who were contributed to the South Asia chapter. And these were Sanjay Adhikari and O.P. Sharma from Nepal, Mr. Masroor Ahmed and Saeed Khisro from Pakistan, Hasim Jahan from Bangladesh, and Vishwanath from India. So what we tried in the South Asia paper actually was to get a perspective of a journey perspective from Latrines to where we are today. And in that spirit, it was a good opportunity to actually engage in South Asia by all of us, because we don't get these opportunities other than SuSanA and some of the international events. And we made full use of the lockdown last year when this was done online, this kind of a discussion. So I think some of the features, as you ask about South Asia, and we tried to narrow it down because you can't put everything in one chapter. So we were looking at the historical process of evolution.
Keep in mind that studies that measure RNA instead of infectious virus are not accurately reflecting actual.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead, Depinder.
Yeah. So if you see the 4 countries which we covered, which are there on the map, but in terms of 3 of the 4, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, we shared a colonial history with British rule. And therefore, a lot of our institutions and systems evolved from that history and a shared background. So that contributed in some ways to what is now seen as a duplication of issues and institutions in South Asian context in all the 3 countries at least, Nepal being the other country which did not have a colonial past. But in many ways, we also saw that if you see, all the 4 countries also have a very similar context of, rural-urban population divide. It is predominantly rural. GDP has been growing very fast. Poverty has been decreasing. Life expectancy is better. And the other salient feature is ODF. So open defecation-free kind of a focus has been very strong here. But in terms of our issues which we saw was people constantly asked this question, why the progress has not been fast enough in South Asia compared to other countries. So yes, compared to East Asia, the progress was not fast enough, and there are certain reasons for that. The kind of sanitation systems they adopted in, say, Malaysia, Indonesia, which we did not adopt because of our colonial history. And secondly, the fact that a lot of our urban sanitation work was in a way condemned to a certain class and caste of manual scavengers. So in many ways, our systems also did not grow so fast, although I would say that Europe took 100 years from 1800 to 1900 to develop its systems. So to expect the same within 10, 20 years of newly independent countries in South Asia would have been too much. But yes, I do agree that there was this caste and class dimension. And therefore, the challenge which we faced in South Asia is, for example, our cities are full of untreated toxic sewage. So whether it is Karachi, whether it is Delhi, or it is Dhaka, the situation is quite similar in all our contexts. And it's not just that we don't, some countries don't have STPs. For example, Karachi does not have a functional STP, but whereas Delhi has many STPs, but they don't function. So, you know, or they don't function to the full extent. So these kind of challenges, along with the issue of drainage and flood, which affects Bangladesh and Nepal much more. So I think their challenges in urban sanitation or sanitation journey, we need to also contextualize for different countries. So I think I can end here and we can come back to the next round where we can have a discussion on how the current challenges are being addressed in our context.
No, absolutely, definitely. So thanks a lot for that. One thing that was particularly interesting for me in that chapter is also about specifically how institutions adapted themselves, how those various informal mechanisms that you had already written about in the chapter. So that's something for the audience to take a closer look when they read. Next, we should move on to Sub-Saharan Africa. So Depinder told us a bit about how there was quite some similarities between different countries in South Asia. But for Prit to explain about Africa, it's a bit more difficult because the context hugely vary even across Sub-Saharan Africa. So Prit, tell us a bit about what's there in the African perspective chapter on the journey. Prit, you're muted.
Thanks a lot, Abishek. Unfortunately, I have to switch off my video due to poor connection, so I hope that's okay. Yeah. Right. Well, with regards to the African perspective, at least what we've tried to present are some of the key challenges that exist in African cities. And this is mostly to do with rapid and uncontrolled urbanization and how sanitation services are not catching up with the pace of urbanization. But also historically that the evolution of institutional arrangements for urban sanitation in Sub-Saharan Africa has been much more centralized compared to other countries in Asia. But nevertheless, in the past decade, several countries have instituted a few reforms in line with decentralization and devolution policies. And the chapter presents three key aspects where we focused on, firstly, the delineation of mandates, namely policy setting, regulation, financing of infrastructure, as well as service provision. And we presented some successful cases of water sector reforms in Kenya and in Zambia. The second aspect that we tackled was dedicated financing mechanism for urban sanitation. And we have some case studies from Kenya, to be specific, the Water Services Trust Fund, as well as the Devolution Trust Fund in Zambia. And then finally, we addressed the formation of successful utility models and regional agencies for infrastructure development and improved service delivery. And we have some cases from National Water and Sewerage Services in Uganda, ONAS in Senegal, ONAD from the Ivory Coast, and ONEA from Burkina Faso. Further on, we also tried to present some of the approaches and frameworks that citywide sanitation improvement we have experienced in the past, which have been instituted by development agencies and NGOs alike. But I have to say this is not an exhaustive list, and there are many more approaches that do exist. And the approaches we focused on was town sanitation planning in Uganda, especially dealing with the rapidly growing small and medium towns. And these were majorly inspired by the city sanitation planning work in India. So a lot of the examples and a lot of the learnings from India have somehow trickled down to the TSP process in Uganda. Citywide inclusive sanitation in Kampala was one of the cases. Upscaling basic sanitation for the urban poor in Kenya, which was a dedicated program for urban sanitation improvements. And last but not the least, the importance of recognition of on-site sanitation mandate, where a few years ago we've seen that this was completely missing, and now there is a clear push for FSM policies on non-sewage sanitation, and definitely a much intensive push for the involvement of private sector in service provision. All of these just goes in line with the recently launched African Sanitation Policy Guidelines by AMCA, which has just come out, which clearly sets the pace for more work to be done for policy and enabling environment for non-sewage sanitation in Africa. Well, these are my 2 words. Happy to discuss this forward in the next round. Thanks a lot, Abishek. That's all from me.
Thanks a lot, Prit, for that very quick overview. So the book is largely split into 2 different parts. Part A is what you just heard about different types of evolutionary perspective from of course, the international cooperation perspective, but also from South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Then in part B, we have tried to map various different types of approaches and tools, giving 1 page over or 1 or 2 page overview of each of these approaches and tools. And to explain a bit about these different tools and approaches, we have Dorothee with us. So Dorothee, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Abishek. So first of all, I also want to thank all the authors and contributors of this publication. For me, it was a truly exciting and a learning experience to be one of the co-authors. And it came at a really important point for me in my life, because I was just finishing up my PhD, and it allowed me to bring out much of the knowledge I kind of gathered for a broader public. So I'm very happy for that. So the first 3 speakers, they gave you a presentation or a summary of the first part A of the publications. So, but there is this part B of the publication, and in the second part, we actually try or attempt or aim to give a systematic but condensed and very easy accessible overview on some of existing planning frameworks and tools. So, how we've chosen them, it's rather subjective. We've chosen them based on our own experience and how we estimated that they have still an impact on the current practice. And we have 17 fact sheets. So each framework or tool is described on these 2 pages, and it summarizes the basic concept, why it has been developed, what purpose does it serve, the current status, where it has been used, if it has been used, and important points and lessons learned. So additionally, for each of these fact sheets, we also indicate what kind of planning phases it might apply to, from the diagnostic to the strategy, evaluation, planning and action phase of urban sanitation planning. And the aim here is really to provide the background information that is underlying the story we're trying to tell in the first part of the publication, but it should also be this entry point, the entry point for anyone that want to learn about these frameworks and tools, and that want to know how they could serve in a specific sanitation planning project in action. So yeah, I think we have a few examples here. You see the sheet flow diagrams. Other fact sheets are about the sanitation, strategic sanitation approach that Roland mentioned. We have sanitation safety planning, sanitation 21. We have the technology applicability framework, and I think I have the possibility to show a table of the different tools and approaches later on, Abishek. And yes. I hand over to you. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Dorothee. I know it's a very difficult task to summarize so many different tools and approaches that were there. Even the selection itself was quite difficult to say what can we summarize here and what we might have to let go. So while you've heard about part A, which is about the evolution, the context, the history behind it, and the part B is about the various different types of tools and approaches, we don't just finish there. We also have a very important final outlook where we talk about saying, hey, we know that sanitation itself is quite diverse and has a lot to offer, but we cannot silo it. It also fits into the larger urban picture. To talk a bit more about the outlook and the other emerging urban approaches, we have Mintje.
Yes, thanks, Abishek. So I have the pleasure today to tell you a bit about the key points from our Sanitation Journey Outlook chapter. So looking at the present and the future and at the emerging approaches that we are seeing. And currently it's quite shown that the COVID-19 outbreak has demonstrated the need and the potential for coordinating urban services across various sectors, and to develop urban strategies that foster integrated planning of resilient urban infrastructure. And that includes sanitation. So in this Outlook chapter, we are showing emerging approaches and the shift from a sector-focused to a cross-sectoral, city-centered approaches. And this also reflects the overarching nature of the SDGs. So sanitation is interlinked with health, with environment, climate, agriculture, and sustainability services. And it also has the potential to be a key element in the achievement of other SDGs. So at a city level, it is quite clear that nowadays challenges of rapid urbanization and impacts of climate change can only be addressed through a collaboration of various sectors and stakeholders. And in addition, we also see an increasing call to address equity as a substantial part within holistic modular sanitation planning. And in this publication, what you can see on the slide, we have highlighted a few of such cross-sectional city-centered approaches. So the green cities or eco-cities, water-wise cities, resilient cities, smart cities, water-sensitive urban design. Those are a few of them, or the most prominent ones. And just to give you a summary, what they all more or less have in common is a focus on intersectoral approaches and having sanitation as one integral part of a resilient green smart city planning that is linked to other services in the city. So these emerging approaches aim at reduce, recycle, and recover, and in being more independent from external infrastructure and more flexible, more robust to the impacts of climate change or to a changing environment that also includes socio-economic changes. So the potential of sanitation in these approaches is also beyond that recognized for energy, for fertilizer, for water reclamation, for urban greenery and beyond. And overall, the aim of all these emerging approaches that we see is to create livable cities, and with resilient sanitation being a substantial basic integrated service in such livable cities. So although we know that an integrated urban master plan is no silver bullet, it could contribute to the way in which well-resourced urban institutions that have the capacities needed and broader policies in place can address today's more complex and intermingled challenges. However, it's also important to consider and look beyond the citywide approaches that we are presenting in this chapter, and to also look at the catchment level and acknowledge the benefits of urban-rural synergies and interactions, such as the water-energy-food nexus, and also to align city-centered approaches with catchment scale approaches. So this we also highlight in this chapter. And with this broad overview, I'll hand back to Abishek.
Thanks a lot, Mintje. I think when we were writing this, we definitely saw, I mean, at least internally asked ourselves, yes, we shouldn't silo sanitation, but handling sanitation is already hard enough. So how are we going to do the overall? But that's, I think, time for another discussion. While we've given you a big overview of what's there in the book between the evolution, the approaches, tools, and the outlook, it's important that this is a lot of it is the author's perspective, but it's important to hear what the reviewers think, who are outside of the writing process, who gave us significant and very valuable feedback, which really changed the nature of the book, as Arne mentioned. So from a very unbiased point of view, Elisabeth, could you tell us what the book, could you place this book, I guess, in an overall, in an overarching contribution of the book to the sector? What do you see the book's potential to be, and so on? What are your thoughts?
Thank you, Abishek. Yes, the overall contribution of the book, I think, has been very beautifully already illustrated by the earlier panelists. But just to repeat, since repetition is the mother of knowledge, we have these two prongs, of one being the history description and the other being this beautiful and pedagogical and therefore very accessible overview of these tools and approaches, which are all aiming for the improvement of the implementation and access to sustainable sanitation services. And this historic overview, it kind of comes from, of course, it's like the international cooperation development sector, sanitation people, it's that view we get there. But it's very useful to see how we in the sector, not me at that time 50 years ago, but how people have been trying to tackle the shortcomings of conventional and piped and sewered and centralized approaches to urban sanitation for the last 50 years. And it's kind of important to remember that this is what we're standing on knowledge-wise. It's our foundation when we're still trying to change the way. But we have made headways, I think, but we're not there yet. So anyways, and I think the book can be very useful in many different aspects, particularly when you want to change urban infrastructure, you need to work with the urban planners very early on in the planning process. And this is where I think it could be particularly useful. And for example, I would like to see a joint massive open online course, maybe for urban planners and sanitary engineers together, where this book could kind of fit in. Mintje was describing these different more integrated approaches. I think the book fits very nicely there. And also in the work of development banks and so on and so forth. And also in teaching in undergraduate and graduate levels. Personally, I would also like to say that I'm extremely happy to have had the possibility to meet several of the people mentioned in the book. And since these people have been so important in shaping the sanitation sector in general, but also shaping me in particular for me. So I'm very happy to have actually had the chance to meet Dr. John Calber-Matten, of course, Professor Duncan Mara, and the late Kevin Taylor, who we lost earlier this year, unfortunately, and of course, Professor Emeritus Roland Schertenleib. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that, Elisabeth. In fact, one of the things that was a key takeaway from me from what you just said is that the book really provides an introduction to non-experts who want to get an overview of the sanitation. I think that was really the aim as authors when we wrote, and it's nice to hear that that aim is sort of fulfilled with this book. Good. Now, just one more round of questions I have to some of these panelists. First, let me start with Roland. Roland, when you showed this linear evolutionary sort of a picture where you had different milestones that came up in urban sanitation in the last 40, 50 years, one thing was interesting. I'm wondering, is it really a linear one, or is there a cyclical nature to it? Because when we put the Bellagio principles, which was written 20 years ago, and then when we put the Manila principles, which was written hardly 2 years ago, there's quite some similarities between these two. My question to you is there an evolution or only a cycle that's happening? What happened in the 80s, is it repeating, or do you see that the agenda is truly moving forward?
Yeah, thank you very much, Abishek. I think first I should say that I have been retired for quite some time, and with my comments, I may not be fully aware of all the latest developments and maybe also not give justice to all the latest developments in the sector, especially on the ground. But yes, if one actually reads and compares some of the documents published in the 1980s and the Bellagio principles formulated in 2000, and then the Manila principles for citywide inclusive sanitation formulated in 2019. And at the same time, one has to take notice that today over 500 million people still have no access to an improved latrine or toilet, and almost 2 billion urban dwellers do not use safely managed sanitation services. One could easily conclude and actually be frustrated, quite frustrated, that no real progress was made in the last 40 or 50 years. However, if I consider that in the 70s and 80s, only very few strange and exotic individuals, including myself, argued and looked for alternative solutions to address the urban sanitation challenge, and that for many years little to no attention was given to sanitation. And if, on the other hand, I look at the SDG Sanitation Target 6.2, adopted in 2017 by all UN member states, I realize that we have come quite a long way. Quite a long way, at least, with regard to a much wider acceptance of the importance of sanitation, the general recognition that a multi-technology and multidisciplinary approach is needed, and last but not least, that sustainable sanitation is much more than just having access to latrines and toilets. I can tell you that, for instance, still in the beginning of this millennium, the situation was such that we could only dream of having a special international conference devoted to fecal sludge management with the participation of high-level politicians. And now, between 11 and 19, we had already 5 of them. So the fact that today so many more people and institutions are interested and involved in pushing the sanitation agenda forward makes me cautiously optimistic for the future. However, and this is my big concern, I have the impression that the changes happened so far mainly in the heads of people, and that the impact on the ground has been still very limited. I hope I'm wrong, but that's my impression. Let me make last 2 comments. I think for too long, and maybe with some people still today, there has been the idea that there is a silver bullet or a golden standard to address the urban sanitation challenge, not realizing that the very different physical and socioeconomic conditions, often even within one city, require a mixture of solutions. And this makes it so challenging. And lastly, I'm convinced that real progress towards better sanitation and sustainable cities in a wider sense can only be achieved if the silo mentality and thinking which dominated the development agenda in the past will be overcome in the future. And I think that the city-centered approaches presented by Mintje, for instance, have a great potential to overcome these limitations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roland. To hear this from you is really valuable, because you've had the first-hand perspective of actually seeing many of these developments happen. So when you say there's actually a change of hearts and minds in people, then that's already very comforting, because Martin Yamro, who's also part of the call today, has always said, if you change hearts and minds of people, the progress will follow on ground. So that's really nice to hear.
Very correct.
Yeah. Now to move on to Depinder, the question is, what are some of the contexts in which these tools and approaches have actually been well received, and why do some tools
are applied well? Why do some tools get tested and taken up, and why some tools and approaches struggle? Could you tell us a bit from your experience in SEBP and others?
Yeah, Abhishek, this is an important point to understand as we approach towards the future. From our experience in sanitation capacity building platform and otherwise also in my current work as in the academia, if you see, individual sanitation is linked to housing and housing is linked to urban planning. So, currently the biggest challenge of approaches, what you are asking me, is how to link these approaches to the formal urban planning context. And that is a big challenge. And I think that is where somehow focus is not there. So for example, currently the urban planning in South Asia certainly, and also I see that in developed countries, is being reduced to nothing but private builder kind of a political agenda. So that formal planning, which was earlier an entitlement legislation, that you should have urban planning where you have spatial planning, where you have land use for different purposes, as an entitlement of citizens and people who live in the cities, is now more or less given up. And we have a very market-led, non-inclusive cities where water and sanitation resources and infrastructure are also being captured by the elite. So if we keep talking about our sanitation approaches, sanitation tools, without looking at the urban planning agenda and the context in which, and if we don't try to strengthen the legislation and the formal urban planning processes, these can remain very small tools and approaches which may not, move forward. So for example, in India and a lot of because India led the ODF process, and the ODF became a mantra not just in Asia but in Africa. In African countries also started looking at India as an ODF objective. And now the discourse is on smart cities. So I think instead of the smart cities, again, as a discourse which primarily was an inclusive cities approach of Latin America, has unfortunately been transformed into an IT solution-based interventions are called smart cities. So I think that discourse has also to change. We should have more of a discourse on inclusive cities rather than smart cities with IT solutions. Unless, as I said, it's in the Latin American framework where smart cities are actually cities for everybody to access, to move around. And the third point I wanted to make here was this whole paradigm change in urban systems. And so you cannot talk of sanitation approaches without looking at the sanitation systems. I bring it lower in my agenda of priorities because on this already a lot of work is being done on promoting decentralized systems, on promoting FSM as non-sewage sanitation solutions. So this paradigm change has to come about. And if that doesn't come about, again, our approaches and tools will not move forward. So for example, in the CPHEEO manual, which is the Central Public Health Environment Engineering Organization in India, it is clearly mentioned that there are huge pitfalls of centralized systems because they consume a lot of water and they may not be suitable for the Indian context. And that is written in the preamble of the manual itself, which is 2015, quite recent. Yet we keep going on promoting centralized solutions. And the last 2 points, one was, of course, capacity building initiatives, which we were involved with. Their capacity building initiatives have to reaffirm this kind of a paradigm shift and also focus on more conceptual understanding rather than just doing skill building. So if we keep doing skill building for different sanitation systems, technologies, approaches, planning, but not focus on the, the kind of a conceptual understanding of context of different countries, within the countries, different contexts. And finally, our experience in India has been that sanitation is a governance channel. It's a challenge. It's not a technology or a systems challenge. So there again, it has to become a political issue. Unless it becomes that, no amount of tinkering either with approaches, tools, financing, systems will make it change. So thanks for giving this opportunity, but I think these 4 or 5 points are very critical in understanding and addressing the challenge of sanitation in South Asia, not just India. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot for Depinder for the very well thought 5 points. I think they're really important to keep in mind. And one thing that you said is that there's a lot of this cross-continental learning. You spoke about how South Asia has taken some cues from Latin America and how some cues are then passed on to Sub-Saharan Africa. And that's where I want to bring Prit in and ask him, Prit, what are then some of the challenges which are much more specific to the Sub-Saharan African context? And then are there lessons learned from South Asia, similar to what Depinder just mentioned? Could you give us a bit more about this? And maybe before you begin, just one small note to the audience. We might be running over time by a few minutes, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. And then, we will keep the call open for questions. So if you're interested, please do stay back. We have now Prit and then one more question to Jennifer, and then we open.
All right.
And Dorothee as well. Yes. Prit.
Thanks, Abishek. Well, apart from what Depinder had mentioned, some of the generic challenges that exist, it is pretty similar to the African context also. But where I see one of the major and particularly specific challenge in the African context is the rapid urbanization, especially in smaller towns, where from my experience, the rate is between 3 and 6% annually. And that's a very fast growing rate. And smaller towns are usually, the rural growth centers that rapidly turn into towns, municipalities, without the necessary support in terms of human and financial capacities at the local government level to tackle sanitation issues. And, typically, if you see, small towns are not particularly attractive for private sector. So due to the low economies of scale. So you have a very important service provider that is kind of negated or falls down the crack. Also, most of our approaches that we see today either tackle rural sanitation or urban sanitation. But small towns are very different. They're very dynamic. And to tackle these issues, we still don't have many approaches when it comes to improving sanitation in small towns. Also in terms of funding, small towns kind of lose out the entire central funding, the national funding when it comes to infrastructure development as such. Traditionally programs are either set in urban sanitation or rural sanitation, but small towns kind of fit in between these and kind of are the orphan child that everybody neglects, while they are the most rapidly growing towns. So I think we need to then start thinking about, really sooner than later, how do we tackle small town situations in the African context itself. With lessons learned from Asia relevant to Africa or from any other continent, I would say yes and no to that question. Asia definitely has the upper hand when it comes to experience, but I would be very wary of taking approaches, from Asia to Africa, quite simply because the African context is quite different to the Asian one, especially in terms of capacities, in terms of how the private sector has developed over the last decades, especially when it comes to enabling environments in place, financing, etc. So there are many factors that make the African context very different from the Asian context itself. Another significant difference between Asia and Africa is what I've seen over the years is I find Asia is more about wastewater and septage management, while African context is more about fecal sludge management. It is primarily due to the large existence of dry pit latrines, which in my experience is 70% of the city's sanitation landscape. So, and in compared to more waterborne systems in Asia, such as septic tanks and soak pits. So most of the tools and approaches we see coming out in the last decade or so are more geared towards septage management and not ideally for fecal sludge management, what we see primarily in Africa. So I would take the lessons learned with a pinch of salt. I would rather believe in approaches and methodologies for sanitation improvements in Africa that should be developed in Africa itself. So I would stop with that.
Thank you so much, Prit. Absolutely, I think one of the key messages in the book has always been context-specific solutions.
Yeah.
So in that regard, I have a question for you, Dorothee. There have been so many tools in the sanitation landscape, and some of which we've mentioned in the book. How does an average planner navigate this, this huge array of different tools, approaches that's available? You give us a bit of an information, especially with respect to the book. How is that planned?
Yeah, so first let me give kind of how I see that a typical user of this book part B could go about. So first one should kind of decide if he's looking for a general framework or one tool for a specific planning phase and where he stands in his planning phase. And second one, next slide, please. If this person has done that, you could have a look actually at this table, which is in part 1, page 30, part A, page 30-31, where we summarize all the different fact sheets and show the innovation contributions as well as the limitations and challenges for each of the frameworks and tools that we present. So then one could have a closer look there and kind of highlight maybe 3 or 5 to start with that he thinks could be appropriate for his given context or could be interesting. And then with these 3, 4, or 5 that one has picked, he could go back to part B and have a closer look at the fact sheets and really help them and think about how he or she would apply the concept in his specific planning project or context. So the next step would be then to discuss with colleagues what they think about it, and then together come up with a contextualized solution. And of course, one would also need to go to the references, which are at the end of each fact sheet, and go to the original literature that talks about the tool. And one could even think about contacting some of the authors to have some first-hand experience to do knowledge sharing. So that's how I see it. But I have one point more. I believe that also just reading through the frameworks would help people to maybe do a more reflected planning design in the future by learning from the different points. And at the end, I want to say how we see that it's like a box of Lego. So that's the modular thing. So you could take different parts and concepts and really mix and match together one's own particular framework or tool that really fits the context. So contextualization is the key, you mentioned it, and there is no one single best framework or the one single best tool, but I would recommend to kind of mix something together. So, but if we really want to have people using the information we have in this book, we really should invest in capacity development. We should reflect the frameworks and tools from a local perspective, and then package this information into recommendations and training packages. Training packages that can be taken up from existing curricular organizations, that can be adapted to the local context, and that kind of can help to bring the knowledge to a very broad range and large sum of practitioners out there. So the aim at the end should be to get that in the standard operation procedures of international NGOs, but also of local governmental and non-governmental organizations. So thereby we maybe finally have an impact on the ground and contribute to better planning practice.
Thanks a lot, Dorothee. That was very clear that there's no one size fits all, even with respect to tools. Read the book and you'll know more. I'm really sorry to Jennifer that we had to wait so long to hear from you, but I think the discussions were so rich that I couldn't have stopped anyone in between. But to you as another reviewer, this book has tried to map
a lot of the different milestones that have happened in the sanitation journey since the 70s. To you as a reader and a reviewer, what are some of the key moments that the book has captured well? And have there been other moments that have been left out? Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Abishek. It has been indeed very interesting to listen to everyone. Thank you all for your insights. I'm not sure how many more new insights I can add already to what has already been said, but I guess to summarize that I think the book does do a very good job in capturing the evolution of the thinking within the sanitation sector, as Roland points out, and how that we actually have come somewhere, showing what the thinking has solidified, I think, and that there's more and more people following this thinking. So I think that the book is very useful in that sense, that it captures this understanding that we've come to together as a sector. So it's in that way, I think that vision, that message is very useful, that it is clearly written out to sort of state this is where we're at. It does a very good job showing the number of tools and linking those tools also to this type of thinking that we have in the sector. So in that way, it's a good starting point, I think, for people entering the sanitation sector, for students, for new practitioners who want to learn about sort of this is the state of the art, this is where we're at. So I think it's a very good sort of unifying document in that case. But of course, there's always this piece that how do we take that vision forward? And I think that's where this book is still missing some piece, or what we can, as Dorothee was saying, how do we actually take this forward? So building the application of these tools and the use of these frameworks that I know there's sort of different levels to how much they've been implemented. Some of them have been implemented more than others. And I really appreciate that you've added the section 4, bringing in the stakeholder perspectives, the practitioners from the Global South, and highlighting those challenges there, which has come up in this discussion as well here. But I think what we really need to start doing is then, taking this vision and these tools that this book highlights and start implementing them and learning from how easy is it to implement these in the work with the utilities in the Global South. We need more hands-on experience with the tools, testing of them and adapting them to the needs of the people, as you're saying, in these local contexts. So as Dorothee was saying, we need training sessions, but I think also more importantly, we need to start building networks of exchange of ideas and experiences. There's a lot of experiences out there. There's a lot of tools out there that are not in these books. How do we start, building this exchange of knowledge that's already there? And I think that's where SuSanA can be very useful, to facilitate this exchange of experiences, facilitate what is the practical learning of use of these tools, what's missing from the tools, what should be added, what's the best way to encourage multiple actors to deal with complex decision making. How do we actually put all of this into practice? And of course, research can help there, that we can do research projects, universities can document that, but I think we also need to start listening to what's being done on the ground. So how can we build on what's out there, start documenting the action that's being taken, and enable more exchange to keep this vision of sustainable sanitation for all actual. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I think it's hard for me to make concluding statements after that, because that was almost perfect. I think my biggest takeaway is, yes, this book is very useful. It's kind of try to bring everybody into on the same page, at least on the same book, in this case, but there's still a lot more work for us to do, because there's the work that's done in the last 60 years on ground, and we need to learn from these different experiences and make these networks work. And thanks for mentioning SuSanA. I think that's the ideal platform for these exchanges to happen further. With that, I think you have the barcode on the book, on the slide that you see, which will directly take you
to the book's page on the SuSanA library. Otherwise, you can find the link on the chat box. The book is open source. It's freely accessible and downloadable. Please take that. We're over time, so we can officially close now, but I still invite whoever else has time in the next 15 minutes to stay on the call. Some of us will continue to be on the call to have some questions taken from the audience. So we open for questions. If anyone has a question, you can either raise your hand and I can notice that. Otherwise, directly switch on your microphone and your video and ask away.
And in between, I'd like to thank you, Abishek and Dorothee, for organizing this.
Yes.
The others for the contribution, but I think great. I'm very happy on World Toilet Day that we have this exchange.
Thank you so much, Arne. Also, thanks to you, all the panelists from my side, and also Shobana, who is also helping us logistically putting this together. Thank you so much. But we're still not finished. We have time for questions from the audience. Anyone has any questions? Otherwise, I mean, we can also ask questions to each other from the panelists, because we ourselves haven't had this platform to exchange.
Abishek, maybe
yes.
There is the question from Martin about the how we talked about condominium sewer systems and the experience from Brazil, and we talk very little about it. There is some references in some of the fact sheets, I know. Maybe some others from that have contributed to the journey chapter could reflect on that.
Yeah, some condominium sewers in Latin America.
Roland, maybe.
Yeah, Burton, I think that's a very good comment, actually. And I must say that this is maybe slightly an omission in the book, that we did not talk enough about these alternative sewer systems, which were especially research was done, of course, by Duncan Mara especially, and his PhD students, and then also implemented in Latin America. So I think I just would refer to the literature with regard to that, and I think this is definitely one of the potentials, and which have quite a good potential. But I don't think that we can go into more detail on that now. I mean, we are not suggesting one or the other. I think we are keeping saying that look at the conditions where we are. And I think we cannot, I mean, as I mentioned in my last comment, I always had the impression that some people think there is a silver bullet, like small bore sewer system, for instance. It's not. Like some people said, VIPs, it is. It's not. It really depends. And I think it was Joel Kalbermatten who said already, there is no such thing as the right technology. There's only such thing as an appropriate technology. Appropriate. Unfortunately, some people took appropriate as cheap. No, appropriate means appropriate to the special situation where we are.
Elisabeth.
Yeah. Elisabeth, you have your...
Yes, thank you. Just a comment on that. I'm fairly sure I commented on this in my review of the journey, but I think it's not about the technology per se. I was after, and I'm sure Martin wasn't after that either. It's like the planning process that led to this very successful implementation of this technology. That's what should be captured, or should have been captured, or should be in a future version. It's not about the technology. It's about they actually did something on utility level that actually worked in terms of getting access to services.
And the planning process was the strategic planning approach, so where it's shortly mentioned? Elisabeth?
I don't know how it worked. I couldn't say. I just think that that's something that this book should capture. I don't know what the process was, but it should have been very interesting for someone to dig into. How did they go about that? And this is what I was after in my review. You know, there are things happening on utility or municipal level that should have been captured.
I think on that line, Martin has his hands up. Martin, do you have an answer or a question for us?
No, I was just going to add to this part of the discussion that yes, there was a concerted participatory planning approach by utilities to reach everyone, and including and especially in slum areas, very successfully in Salvador, in Northeast Brazil, and in Brasilia, the capital, for example. But also, what's important is they challenged and changed norms and standards nationally to allow small bore sewers and to allow there to be greater distances between manhole covers, for example, manhole inspection chambers. So I think there's some very important lessons there in terms of challenging the norm and going about your planning approach in a participatory way, but also your implementation and your management approach that allows everyone to be reached with services. So I'd be happy to discuss it further at some other point.
That's very true, because it's ultimately whatever planning approach we have, whatever technologies we choose, there needs to be this enabling environment for the uptake of that. And precisely what you said, in Brazil, they had to change some of these rules and regulations, and the same problem currently we're facing even in Colombia, where the condominial sewers or even decentralized technologies, you're not able to implement them because the rules and regulations don't allow for them. So that's another part, of advocating for change, creating the enabling environment. I think that's also extremely important. Any other questions at this point? Okay.
I'm as well overdue since 15 minutes in another seminar. But it's so nice to have met you on this day. And thanks, Martin, to collect lighthouse positive examples. They're so rare. And Elisabeth, Martin, yes, if we have one, let's describe it more often. Yeah. Okay.
So, then we already
from my side, I'm running.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I guess we already have quite a bit of takeaways from today as to what the future work could be, documenting lighthouse case studies, creating another book for how to make the enabling environment, and so on. So thank you so much once again to all the panelists, to all those who tuned in today. I think a bigger audience would also be when we put this on YouTube and pass it around to our colleagues in a more friendly time zone. They can sign in. So thank you very much from my side, and wish you a happy World Toilet Day. Happy flushing.
Thank you, Abishek, and thank you to everybody.
So much for a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining. Yeah.